Working with the wine industry in Ontario was certainly one of the greatest thrills of my life. Wine is magical, I learned in that particular undertaking about what characters there are in the wine industry, and they're just risk takers. And there was a saying going around: the way to turn a large fortune into a small fortune is to get into the wine business. But people that are willing to do that are truly leaders in their own profession. Good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And Doug and Madam Dean, thank you. Madam Dean, thank you for those kind words. I've got my strongest critic sitting right here on my right, making me a little nervous. But that's okay. She also has played a significant role in my evolution as a senior administrator, and I would hope as a leader, but certainly as a senior administrator over the years. I should confess to you at the very outset that I've never studied leadership formally. I've never taken a course in leadership. I've never taken a course in management. I don't read the leadership books, period. I don't read the admin books. My wife has a master's degree in education administration. We talk constantly about administrative matters, but I've never had that interest. I am a zoologist, I'm an entomologist, and if you'd asked me to speak on the research on the mating system of insects, I think I would have some expertise there. So what I'm going to describe to you today is sort of my personal experiences, my personal recollections, my personal journey, if you will, through 18 years as a senior administrator. Can you hear me back there, Rich? Okay, good. Speak a little louder. All right. I have been in senior administration for 18 years. That's 10 years as dean. One of those years I spent as VP, acting VP, and then of course 8 years as the president of this wonderful institution. So that's some experience that I've had over the years, and I'll talk a bit about the lessons that I've learned. And I'm not going to grade myself, okay? That's not for me to do. That's for my board to do. That's for you to do. That's for others to do. But I'll describe sort of the ideal state that I have for what administrators should be and leaders should be and what they should strive to be. I said to one of our deans one time, and this was I'll identify the comment as a kind joke, actually, but I said to a dean of management one time, I said, I've never had a management course, and I'm a manager. And the dean said back to me, Mr. President, you'd be such a better president if you'd had a management course. A big smile on that person's face. I'm not going to identify who the particular dean was, but I'm going to take a cue from Andy Haken the other day when he spoke at the Keitel seminar, and that is when you meet for the first time with a class to let people know a little bit about yourself. And Jane's given you a bit of the professional side of me, and I'll tell you a little bit more about, since this is a personal journey, I hope to have a conversation with you about. Let me tell you just a little bit more about myself. I was a schoolboy in San Antonio. I went to the San Antonio Catholic schools, the St. Peter's Prince of the Apostles School for 8 years. The nuns were outstanding educators and teaching all the academic skills, but they were mean. They were very mean. They were very mean to me. And I remember kneeling by the side of my desk with my books over my head, or being whacked on the hand with a ruler, or in those days, the nuns would sometimes punish. It always seemed to be the boys who were getting punished. I later in life was to talk to women who had gone through Catholic school, and I was reassured, no, it wasn't just the boys. But I remember being punished one time by being made to memorize the Bill of Rights of the United States. That's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In those days, I had a really good memory, so that was not a punishment, and I could do that quite readily. The other thing I sort of want to qualify my remarks about is I don't intend to speak about the issues of the day. I did have an email from my faculty member who could not be here encouraging me to address a particular issue of the day. It was, in fact, the corporatization of universities. And that isn't going to be my theme today. If you want to talk about particular issues, we can, but that's not going to be my approach. Rather, I'm going to give sort of an overview of some things that I think I've learned. I don't know how well I've learned them, but that I'm still learning about being an administrator within our modern university system. I was raised by my mother and my aunt Blanche. My father died when I was very young. The other very important person in my life was a woman named Virginia, an African American who worked with my mother, for my mother, all those years. And those three women really took good care of me. I think I owe a lot to all three of them, and I'm always reminded of things my mother taught me about how to behave, how to talk. The fact that I went to university is entirely due to my mother. I wanted to be an auto mechanic. I mean, for a while there, I held the San Antonio Stock Raceway Class A drag record at the San Antonio Drags. I had a 409 Chevrolet, 425 horsepower, 456 positive traction rear end. And I remember the speed that I ran the quarter mile in that stood as a record for a while was 13.42 seconds. That's nothing. You could almost walk down a quarter mile today in that. And so, I mean, I was really keen, and we worked on cars a lot. I was really keen to do that for a living. My mother said, no, you're going to school. In fact, she'd say, no, little Bill, even though I was, 18. She'd say, no, little Bill, you're going to go to school and be a doctor just like Big Bill. My father was Bill Cade, his father was Bill Cade, his father was Bill Cade. And my father and all his brothers were internists in San Antonio. So from an early age, and as I say, I was raised by my mother and her maid and her sister. My father died when I was young. But from an early age, that's all I heard from my father's partners and friends and so on. So I'll go off to Texas. I'm going to be a zoology major because that was a good pre-med major. And, I probably made a D, a C, and 2 Fs. And I was immediately put on scholastic probation, right? My first semester. And I didn't see the value of school. But right at the time, this would have been 1965 then, the Vietnam War was heating up. And I have no qualms in telling you, the reason I got serious about my studies is, frankly, I did not want to die in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And I don't say that flippantly in any way, but it was a motivator to go to school and to study. And I sort of discovered that I liked zoology. It was interesting. It seemed to deal with all kinds of topics, the behavior of individuals, the physiology of individuals, the genetics of populations, all the things that biology has become as a modern science. I decided not to study pre-med. That was a real easy decision, and I tell you the story with a little reservation. I went into the experimental science building one time for advising, and the line for pre-med advising must have been 300 people long. The line for zoology was maybe 3 or 4. I got in the zoology line, and I never looked back. And I'm really glad I did that, because I think I've had one of the most interesting careers as an academic, both as a scientist, as a teacher, as a faculty member, and as an administrator, that I would not have had if I'd gone into medicine, if I could have even pursued that. So, my background is not exactly stellar academic. We stumble into these various things as we make our way through life. I taught high school for a while after I got my zoology degree from Texas. I never had an education course at the time, but there was a great shortage of teachers in a particular school district in San Antonio. It's the Edgewood Public School District. It's very well known in American educational circles because it's the poorest in the state of Texas, and it's the 17th largest. It's almost entirely Mexican-American. The teachers in those days were almost entirely Anglos, and many of us taught without the benefits of having any formal training as a teacher. I did become certified over time. I became certified by taking courses at one of the Catholic universities in San Antonio, and I thought I could devote the rest of my life to high school teaching. I really loved it. That first day on the job, though, I taught 7th grade initially. That first day on the job, though, I'll tell you, oh boy, I remember 2 things about that. Now, I got an emergency certificate from the state of Texas, and I walked into this classroom maybe 8 or 9 weeks into the term, and they had a whole series of substitute teachers. Now, those of you that know about the schools, Madam Superintendent, you will know that that's not always a good environment to walk into. And I thought these young kids were going to sit there and take notes the way I had. No. Pam shaking her head. No, that didn't way happen. So I remember 2 things from that first day on the job. Well, 3 things. I didn't take notes. The second thing I remember from that first day on the job, my feet were just killing me. I'd been on my feet all day long. And the third thing I remember was a little kid named Jose Luis Garcia, named after the famous boxer Joe Louis. And I'd lost my temper at him during the 4th period of the day. It was the final period, and there were hour-and-a-half periods. And I'd lost my temper at him, and I'd gone up and leaned into his desk and said, if you don't shut up, I'm going to, and I don't remember exactly what profanity I used, but I knew I'd made a mistake right away. And he reels back and he says, sir, what you said? And I thought, oh, they're going to fire me. There's no point in even coming back. They're going to fire me. Well, they didn't fire me. As it turned out, they were desperate to have people in the classroom. And it turned out I came back the second day and the third day, and I think I spent 4 years teaching school in the Edgewood district. Became certified, learned a great deal about myself. There is no tougher audience than the 7th grade, bar none, bar none. But I found it really satisfying work, and as I say, I could have done that the rest of my life. However, I noticed on the bulletin board of my high school, by then I've been transferred to the high school teaching biology and human physiology and chemistry. I remember teaching the gas laws wrong. I had to go, I had to go back to the class and admit, ooh, I got it all wrong. You know? But I was in the teacher room, the mailbox room one day, and there was a little notice up there about a one-year institute for science teachers sponsored by the National Science Foundation to return to Texas for a year. And I applied for that, and lo and behold, I got it. We got married in the interval there, and we went back to Texas for 1 year. And I decided to pursue a master's degree in zoology during that year rather than an education master's, which was...
Were you disappointed?
They got disappointed later on when I decided to stay beyond 1 year. But I met a man. His name is Daniel Ati. Ati grew up in Zululand, a little place called Untunjambili, and he is one of the world's experts on grasshoppers. And I'm a type A obsessive person. I always turn in my assignments early, and I turned my assignments in early to Dan. And one day he said to me, "Have you ever thought about doing a PhD?" And I said, "Well, no, not really, but why don't we talk about it?" And one thing led to another, and I became one of his graduate students. And here it is 35 years later, and Dan and I are very close friends. And the African work that Jane was good enough to mention is all work that Dan and I have done throughout many parts of, especially southern Africa. Brock was a great place to be. I spent 23 wonderful years at Brock. I think in many ways I see the culture of the U of L, the culture of Brock, the age of Brock, the way the schools have grown, their emphasis on the well-being of students. I see it as very similar. I have avoided by and large saying, Madam Dean, well, the way we did things at Brock. You know, I don't mean that by it. It just, I felt like I grew a great deal academically, socially, culturally during those years I spent at Brock. But I went there to spend 2 years. We'd never been north of Dallas, had a brand new PhD, get a job offer from this place, Brock University. I didn't even know who Sir Isaac Brock was. Sometimes I like to ask Westerners, who was Sir Isaac Brock? Not everybody can tell, and I won't put you on the spot right now. But Sir Isaac Brock, of course, was killed by an American rifle ball in the Battle of Queenston Heights in the War of 1812. And the monument to Brock looks directly across the river at the United States as a reminder. Well, Canadians say they won that war, you know, it's, we could debate that, I suppose, but Brock was just a great place to be. Brock's biology department was and is a very strong biology department. And I found myself running as fast as I could to keep up with those people. So our secret plan to spend 2 years in Niagara, in Canada, and then return to the United States quickly became non-existent. We bought a house there. Our daughter was in school there. It was a wonderful place to be for 23 years. And I worked my way through the ranks, and you know, from assistant to full and so on. I was involved with the Faculty Association extensively, and eventually became dean. And did 1 year as acting VP. Toward the end of my remarks here, I'm going to talk about the different levels of administration within our university. Not this one, but you know, within the modern North American university, and what some of the characteristics are. Being a VP is a real difficult job. I only did it for 1 year. Not because I got kicked out or anything, but eventually became a full at Brock. Okay, leadership. What is leadership? Well, goodness, I mean, there must be as many definitions of a leader as there are people that follow leaders. There certainly is ample material written about leadership, both in an educational context and in our society at large. Any newspaper, pick up the Globe and Mail, and they will describe leadership situations, problems that arise from time to time. There's ample stuff to read out there. And when I say I never read it, I'm not being entirely truthful. I read what I think would be especially useful to me. I do read, okay, but I don't find reading about leadership especially entertaining. So that's what I'm getting at there. So formal definitions. Well, I wasn't even going to give you any formal definitions, but somebody gave this to me right as I was coming down here. The difference between a boss and a leader. The boss drives employees, the leader coaches them. The boss depends on authority, the leader on goodwill. The boss inspires fear, the leader generates enthusiasm. The boss says I, the leader says we. The boss places the blame for the breakdown, the leader fixes the breakdown. The boss knows how it's done, the leader shows how it's done. The boss uses people, the leader develops people. The boss takes credit, the leader gives credit. The boss commands, the leader asks. The boss says go, the leader says let's go. I think that's kind of a neat way of comparing being a boss and being a leader, which I think administrators at one time or another have to play both roles. I mean, some of the formal definitions are the ability to inspire, the ability to excite, the ability to plan, the ability to motivate. All those things, I'm sure, now describe modern leaders, or for that matter, leaders for our species as long as we've been around. I don't know how similar crickets and humans are. I tend to think we obey the same rules, and those rules are called natural selection. And I think as an animal behaviorist, I've benefited in being able to observe our species at meetings, mind you, or, right now, whatever it may be. So I'm a student of behavior. I'm a student of animal behavior, and in that group I, of course, include our species. I thought I might spend a little time talking about what I think some of the characteristics of leaders are, rather than definitions of leaders. And in that way, give you a feeling for how I define a leader, and hopefully generate some discussion later on. Well, it's pretty obvious you've got to be able to communicate. It's pretty obvious you've got to know the people that you're communicating with. Know your audience, know your organization, know your institution. People follow leaders. Some use the term followers. Know your followers. Know them well. Be able to communicate with them. I learned a lot of rules as dean. One of the ones that always sticks in my mind about communication are the so-called 3 B's of public speaking. And some of you have probably heard me use this. This is not just for leaders, mind you. It works in the classroom too. 3 B's of public speaking are be polite, be brief, and be seated. So I hope I follow that rule today. But it's sort of obvious that you must be able to communicate well, and you must have appropriate interpersonal skills to be able to work with the very diverse individuals that we come across in our institution or in any institution, whether it be Canadian Natural Resources or a university setting. I don't know the difference between leaders in education and leaders in the private world, frankly. It's the universities I know, and so that's the experience I speak of. But I suspect that there are commonalities across all kinds of institutions in our society, and that leaders arise when the time is right. You've got to have respect for people, and they've got to respect you. And you've got to have trust in people, and they've got to trust you. And I think that's pretty obvious as well. My mother was the greatest communicator. Now I know that not all Albertans are going to understand this, but in the Lone Star State there's something called Texas bullshit. Maybe you've heard about that. Well, my mother was the best. My mother was the absolute best. She could talk to anybody and everybody about anything. About anything. She was a real conversationalist, and I hope a little bit of that rubbed off on me. Well, another thing I really think is important for leaders to demonstrate, especially within the academy, is you absolutely must take satisfaction in the success of others. You absolutely must take satisfaction in the people that report to you. I mean, when Peter Rand, one of my biology profs when I was Dean of Science, was admitted to the Royal Society, that was one of the best days I remember being Dean of Science, because we had pushed Peter, we had nominated Peter, we had gotten the referees all in place, and I thought that was a tribute to my faculty, that Peter Rand was admitted to the Royal Society. I've seen too many administrators within universities who have trouble with that, frankly, and I don't really understand it. It's a lesson you can learn. It's a lesson you can learn. It's, most people that find themselves in deanships or presidencies and so on are driven individuals. They're usually type A's. They can be obsessive compulsives, I know. But you can learn if you don't know it automatically that when somebody wins a 3M award in your university, that is something to be satisfied about. Not to feel competitive, not to feel envious, not to feel jealous. And so I think that in the 3 B's thing is kind of not really a joke, but that business about taking satisfaction in the success of others, especially those that report to you, I think is the most important thing I learned as dean. I think leaders are situational. We always say that. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Last year there were 3 university presidents that left office after 15, 18 months. They were clearly not the right individual for the situation that they were hired into. But fortunately, that's the minority of individuals. Terry White was the president of Brock University for 8 years. I had the pleasure of being his dean for 8 years. Terry was the right person for the right time. He was the right person for the situation that Brock was in those days. Brock sits on top of the Niagara Escarpment. It looks down on the city of St. Catharines. The great relationship that we enjoy with Lethbridge, with the community of Lethbridge, is not the situation you would find in St. Catharines. There's always this town-gown divide. It was really quite bad. It had started with a feud between the local newspaper and the university. There was a faculty club up on the top of that tower, the Brock Tower, it actually had a 13th floor, and it looked down on the city. So during lunchtime, the faculty would go up there and they'd have a glass of wine with their food. And the paper was owned by the Burgoyne family in those days, and they, very conservative family, they wrote an editorial condemning faculty's use of alcohol during the lunch hour. Well, you can imagine. I mean, you know what that set off. That set off a bunch of shocked and appalled letters from the faculty to the newspaper. And it just started this, I mean, I wasn't there then, but it seemed to be the cause of this split. I guess about 2 weeks after I went to Brock, the newspaper ran an editorial. In those days, they were looking for a place to put the regional headquarters, Niagara Regional Headquarters. And the newspaper ran an editorial that says, let's close down the university and move the regional headquarters there. And I thought, are you crazy? I mean, I just come from Austin, where the University of Texas is king, believe me. I mean, it influences the town and the state like no other institution in the state. And I thought, you want to give up a university, given all the economic importance, social importance, cultural? Well, obviously they didn't do that. But some of you have heard me tell the story. I taped that up on my office wall to where no one could see it when they came into my office. In those days, I used an electric typewriter, a Selectric, and I'd be working on a manuscript or something, and I'd look up and go, oh, God, I've got to get out of here, you know. They're going to close this place down. I've got to write that paper. Well, it didn't happen, and Brock's now 15,000 students, and those are half of them are part-time students, but I think Brock's done just a really good job of evolving as a university. Terry, when he went to Brock, faced this incredible division between the town and gown. And Terry, if you know Terry, he's extremely personable. He, like my mother, could talk to anybody about anything, anywhere. I mean, one of the greatest stories about Terry came from a restaurateur in Niagara. He had a flat by the side of the road. Terry stopped and helped him fix replace his tire one day. Well, that was Terry White. And that's exactly what Brock needed then. Brock needed somebody that would go down the hill into the community and bring the university down the hill, so to speak, down the escarpment. And so he was just ideal for the time. Terry went to the U of C, and I don't know if Terry's skills were the right skills for the U of C. I think it was too big for Terry. So even though he was a successful president, he left after 5 years and went back into the ranks and won teaching awards back in the ranks, which I always thought he was a great teacher too. So leadership has to be situational. I was the president of the Faculty Association and the chair of the Biological Sciences Department when Joe Meeker encouraged me to put my name in the hopper for selection as a science dean. And of course, like many people, I say, yeah, sure, why not? Probably never happened, but sure. So I did put my name in the hopper, and some months later, lo and behold, I got appointed as dean of the Faculty of Mathematics and Science. And my term as the Faculty Association president ended 17 days or something like that before I became officially the dean of science. And you know, I mean, I was Levi's and golf shirts and, you know, sneakers and typical biologist, and didn't own a suit. And I thought, this was quite deliberate, and I took a lot of grief for this. I thought, okay, I got to do something that establishes that I have a new role to play in this university. I mean, I've been there a long time. I knew a lot of people really well, and they knew me in this context, going from the faculty association to senior administration overnight. What did I do? I went out and bought suits. Listen, it worked. I took terrible grief for about a year. I think, well, goodness gracious, you just turned into a suit. But I appreciated the value of suits the day I took my daughter shopping at the Penn Center. And we've been in the mall many times before, and the clerks just ignored me. And I go in a suit, and they're all over me. Now, I'm kidding, of course, but not entirely. I'm not entirely kidding. I've clearly, in the job I now have, I wear a business suit. I meet in the city or in the government circles. They're all wearing suits. I think if you're going to represent the place well, you've got to dress the part. And so I don't know which suit I'm on now, but there have been a number of them over the years, haven't there? When you arrive and how you leave is a real important saying, I think, for administrators. Say what it is. How you arrive and when you leave. So it's, how do you arrive as dean? Well, you go out and buy suits. Or how do you arrive as president? Well, you go around, you meet all the departments, or you join Rotary, or whatever it might be. And when you leave is real critical, too. Because I think we've all heard the saying, leave when they want more. Another version of that is leave when you want more. Deciding when you should leave is a theoretical issue that I don't know anybody has the answer to, but I've certainly known a lot of people who stayed too long at administrative jobs. And the work that they did when the leaving was good is often forgotten by the people that had to put up with him or her for the years that were too long. So that's the 3 B's of public speaking: take satisfaction, the success of others, how you arrive, and when you leave. These are sort of Bill Cade's rules to try to live by. I had 10 wonderful years as dean. I have to admit that I was bored at the beginning of my second term, and then the Wine Institute came along, and it was just fascinating to work on that project. And now if you want to study enology or viticulture, you have 3 choices in North America. 2 of them are in California, and 1 of them is in St. Catharines, Ontario. And Enniskillen Hall is one of the finest laboratory buildings I've ever been in, and it is devoted to wine. The cellar of Enniskillen wine, the Canadian Wine Library, is like a cellar you would find in the absolute best wineries or restaurants. People threw money at this project because it was wine. It was magical. It was like magic. Sometimes I think about water here, and there's no biblical analogy intended there. But sometimes I think water has the same thing here. You just don't get intoxicated by it, but I suppose you could if you drank enough of it. Well, ABWA is administration by walking around. I think many people are familiar with that it's good to be out, it's good to be seen, it's good to be heard, it's good to drop into offices. I mean, there was a joke in administration circles at Brock about have the meeting in the faculty member's office because you can leave when you want to leave. But if you're in your office, then it doesn't always work out that readily. I do think it's becoming harder and harder for administrators to be out and be seen. I think a lot of us spend quite a bit of time in Edmonton in the community. And when I come back to talking about the different sort of levels of administration, I'll refer to that. But you obviously got to be out there and be seen, and ABWA is what it's often referred to. Well, you got to respect reporting structures. Reporting structures are extremely important. And the first thing that a new president or a new dean will face is people trying to do end runs around the reporting structure. Always happens, always will. And you can't let that happen. Because if you adopt the dean's problems for him or her, then they're your problems. And that's okay, maybe not. But then you've got a dean who is not as effective as you'd like that dean to be either. And you just encourage people to continually do runarounds of reporting structure. And I think in a way that's why the administration by walking around is in conflict with the reporting structure. Because if you're really going to have the deans be the leader of their academic units, they don't want you dropping in all the time, walking the halls. Occasionally is okay, I think, isn't it? But, it's my university too. So I think respecting the reporting structures that we have is extremely important. It's not to say there doesn't come a time when you have to intervene. That does happen. After all, you have responsibility for, ultimate responsibility in the president's role for supervising the vice presidents and the deans and so on. But if you respect your deans, if you trust those in the administration that report up the line to you, then leave them alone. Let them do their job. And almost always it works out really well. Sometimes it's hard to find out if things aren't going as well as they should be, but I've always had a great deal of respect for reporting structures and do my best to maintain them. Conflict, well, I think conflict's essential. You got to have conflict. Now there's conflict that can be damaging, no question about that. But the kind of conflict we usually deal with, the arguing over the canon, the arguing over the curriculum, the arguing over a course description, arguing over terms of reference of a scholarship, whatever it might be, vision statements, mission statements. It's essential to have that conflict. You absolutely must have it or you won't know what people think. That's the only way that a leader, somebody in the position of a senior administrator, can find out what people really think, is to allow them to engage in conflict to the point where it's not damaging, to the point where it's productive and so on. You've got to manage that. You've got to manage in your own life when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you build a scenario that, my goodness, if that happens, then this is going to happen, and then I might do this, you know. You got to manage that because it's not healthy. It's not healthy for you as a leader. It's not healthy for the people that you're leading, frankly. But you absolutely have to have conflict. You can't do without it. Well, in our environment, credentials are real important. I mean, I don't think it's possible. There have been examples of people brought into university administration from outside the academy. They're not always successful. Business schools, management schools have done this on occasion. It's much more common in the United States than it is in Canada. I don't think it would work in an institution such as ours. I think the only way you can have an effective administrator, dean, vice president, or president is for that person to have done everything that the faculty have done and to move through all the ranks that the faculty are expected to move through. So being a full professor of biology, I joke and I say this with a big smile on my face when I talk to my board chair. I say, well, you know, Bob, if things aren't going real well, you know what to do. The worst thing you can do to me is make me a full professor of biology. You know? And I smile. But and seriously, you know, I don't think I would be the president of this university if I were an associate professor. Certainly not if I was an assistant professor. I've seen some associates that are very successful deans. It's not a requirement. But it's pretty close to it. Being a successful academic, I think, is essential for senior administrators in the academy as we now know it. Well, I don't know, I don't see Nancy or any of our CAs here today, but I would say that I've learned to value CAs. When I'm sitting in this very room during the audit exit committee and there's a lawyer on the board and I are the only people in the room that are not accountants, and I look around the room and I'm like, oh my goodness, you know. But I've learned to read a balance sheet and I've learned to read a budget and all those things, but they're not hard to read. You don't have to come from an accounting management background to do that kind of stuff. Somebody else can do it for you. Delegate, respect, trust people to do it for you. But you've got to be able to read those things too as a leader. I certainly think we drift into these roles. I know Andy said this at his Keitel or Seidel presentation the other day about how much you miss teaching. Boy, I do too. I think most of us, when we take on these roles, have no idea what we're going to have to give up to do these roles effectively. And I taught first-year biology every year I was dean. I taught it as part of a team. It was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8:30. It was a way I could get my day going. I mean, I'd get revved up teaching these students in the morning. But it's, as Andy said it in his presentation, the difference is, though, and all these jobs have changed. Dean's jobs have changed, president's jobs, provost's jobs. And one characteristic of it is your schedule is constantly in flux, constantly in flux. It might be that the minister's coming to town, or it might be there's been a special meeting called of the 4 university presidents. Or something like that. So the ability to say, I will be in the classroom every day, Tuesday, Thursday at 10 o'clock, it ain't there. And so that pretty much takes you out of the classroom. I do still maintain a lab, and I've got about 6 undergraduate students in my lab, but they're by and large supervised by my postdoctoral fellow. I don't see a lot of them either. I really miss that. And as the former president of UNBC told me not too long ago, he's on a research leave now, His goal is to return to the classroom and to end his career back in the classroom. And I certainly think that's an admirable goal on the part of Dr. Jago. But we do drift into these roles. You know, I was on AUCC, the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada. It's the umbrella organization for the degree granting schools in Canada. I was on a site visit with 3 other university presidents in Toronto last year about this time. Tyndale University College runs a seminary and a undergraduate program, and they have been certified to offer degrees by the Ontario government, and so they have applied for membership into AUCC. And when that happens, they send in a team. AUCC sends a team to, to check out various features of the application of the school. And that was fine. And I'm not going to comment about Tyndale. I mean, that process is still going on. But I met somebody during the interviews there, and I'm not even going to identify his title, because I think he's still working there. And we were just talking casually before the formal meeting was starting, and he said, well, you know, this is my last year. I'm going back to graduate school at U of such and such. And I said, oh, what are you going to study? He said, well, I'm going to study administration because I want to be just like you. And by that, he wanted to be a university president. I should have done him a favor. You know, I should have said, don't ever tell anybody that. Because, frankly, my view is, if some young assistant professor were to tell me, my goal is to be a university professor, a president, let me repeat that, my goal is to be a university president, I want nothing to do with that person. I mean, that is not an appropriate goal for most people at that stage of their career. You know, I could have said why, but I said, oh, isn't that nice? Just like my mother would have said. You know? But I didn't. No, I think we drift into these roles, and I mentioned Josephine Meeker, a dear friend of mine, now retired. Josephine came out here when I was installed. And yes, she's the one that got me into being dean. She said to me quite innocently one day, Bill, you make a great dean. Why don't you let your name stand? Okay, Josephine, that sounds fine. And you know, one thing leads to another. One thing leads to another. I was dean for 10 years. I then went on a sabbatical leave for a year. I was perfectly prepared and looking forward to returning to the ranks. Get a phone call one day. Would you like to be considered for a University of Lethbridge job? Yeah, sure. That sounds good. Of course, put my name in the hopper. And of course, you never think any of these things are going to happen. You drift. You drift into these things. People nudge you, and you don't know who they are. They're your friends. They're your colleagues. They'll say, you know, Dr. So-and-so, gosh, you know, the deanship's coming open. You should be thinking about that. Listen to those people. Listen to them. That's the kind of motivation, I think, that leads people into administrative roles that should be in administrative roles, not people that set out from the beginning and say, my goal is to be a leader. That's the boss that I described earlier more often than the leader. Well, be practical. Occam's razor is a principle in science. The principle essentially is when you have competing hypotheses, accept the simplest one. So if your hypotheses about why the ants have raided your picnic table, one of those hypotheses may be the ants just want to give you a hard time, and they love the peanut butter sandwiches you made and all that, versus the ants are out foraging and they came across food. What is Occam's razor says, don't fool with the more complicated hypothesis, explore the simpler one. I think Occam's razor applies to being a leader. There is a wonderful little book. It's called To Rise Above Principle. Memoirs of an Unreconstructed Dean. I love it. It is, the only book that caused me to laugh more was Catch-22. It is no longer protected. If you Google it, you can get the entire text on the web. And in that book, the man who wrote it under a pseudonym. He was the Dean of Arts and Science at Ohio State, I believe. One of the big ones, any Ohio State or Michigan State. And he wrote it under a pseudonym because he didn't want anybody to identify the individuals that he described in the book. And I read this thing when I first became dean. I thought, I know all those people. You know, and Occam's razor, I guess the reason I brought in Occam's razor there is one of the things I remember was how the vice president was leaning on the deans to have the deans answer their own telephones, because the deans would rely on their office assistant to answer the phone for them. And the dean was writing, doesn't the vice president understand? Nobody wants to talk to me. They want to talk to my assistant who really knows what the answer is. So go for the simplest explanation. But I'm going to say the title again, I just love it. To Rise Above Principle. Memoirs of an Unreconstructed Dean. He was eventually outed. His name did become known. It's a very delightful, very short read, very humorous. I do think we know leaders when we see them. Aside from these characteristics, and I could probably go on with a few more, but I was riding my bicycle one day with a fellow dean of mine, Lou Sirocco. He was the dean of social sciences at Brock. We used to ride a great deal. Lou was an ardent NDPer, and I'm a Texas Democrat. So we would argue as we would ride, and we were arguing on that particular day about what a leader is. And Lou had all these theoretical constructs and whatnot, and I thought, all right, that's fine. We're standing by the side of the Welland River, which was raging after some rainstorms that day. And I said, listen, Lou, I know people that I would swim this river with, and I know there are people that I would not swim this river with. And by saying that to him, what I meant was, you know leaders when you see them. And you know what I mean. And you know poor leaders when you see them. You know good leaders when you see them. You know leaders that have had a bad day. You know leaders that have had a good day. But you know them when you see them. So all these formal definitions and so on, I think are useful to think about. But basically, you know who you'll swim that river with, and so do I. And there's a bunch of people I wouldn't, but there's certainly a bunch of people I would swim that river with. Well, leaders have lots of challenges. An analogy to the end runs that people tend to make within the organizational structure is people tend to go directly to the top of an organization now. Email allows that, and that's okay. But I can't tell you how many times I get emails from a student who has an issue with a particular course, and they're good issues, they're important issues, but they're not issues I can solve, and they're not issues I can deal with. I always answer them, always. And I'll always say, well, thank you very much, and I'll copy it to the dean. And I'll say, this is a matter you really need to bring up with your dean, and I've copied this to your dean, and please make an appointment to see the dean. It's not just deans, it's parents. I mean, any number of times parents have contacted me directly. We had a parent contact us just this last week about an incident that occurred off campus. And the hardest thing you have to say to parents is, I can't talk to you about your daughter or your son because they're an adult and they have privacy rights too. And that doesn't go over too well with parents. But see, parents go directly to the top, no matter what the issue is. And I think we do that in all kinds of organizations now, not just within universities. But I do think it's a challenge to leaders. I think dealing with boards of governors is a significant challenge. And boards of governors have changed dramatically in the post-Enron era. I don't know how many times we've had this discussion at our board. Sarbanes-Oxley is the law in the United States that was intended to bring some rigor to boards and some greater responsibility to boards. And it's been argued about a great deal. Well, I can't tell you how many times Sarbanes-Oxley has been said in this room at board meetings. Now, this is good. This is good. But you need to understand, when you're working with your board, you are dancing with your board. You're not controlling your board. They're not controlling you. They're dancing with them, literally. And I think I'll leave that metaphor as it is. We are right now, in this university, very fortunate in that we do not have a management board. We have a governing board. A managing board is the board that gets involved and says, well, I think you should plant 10 trees over there. Or, you need a stop light here. And, we get a bit of that. But we usually say, thank you for your suggestion. We'll take it under consideration by management. You pay us to run the place. You know what to do if we're not doing a good job. And that's when I say, I'm a full professor. So I think a serious problem is that we don't tell our leaders what we expect of them. I wasn't real sure why I was hired here, and maybe that's good. And I certainly wasn't aware of any of the issues of the day when I was hired here. Maybe I'd even call them problems. Every place has issues. Every place has problems. And I'm not sure you want new hires to be indoctrinated. After all, you want to sell the place and you want them to come join you, and you don't want to scare them off. But I do think we need to tell individuals, help them to understand what expectations we have of them when they take on leadership roles, whether it's within our courses, in our faculties, or within our universities. I'll tell you, one of the hardest things to deal with is this phenomenon called kiss up and kick down. Kiss up, kick down. What does that mean? That means you treat the people that you report to like they're gods. You kiss up to them, and you kick down at those who report to you. It is a form of bullying. It exists in all institutions, as far as I know, and it's hard to detect for the leader. It's very hard to detect, because what's going on is the people that are being kicked down here see the relationship that the leader has with their immediate supervisor, and there's this tremendous, and especially if you're a person that says, I respect reporting lines, all right? It's very hard for those individuals that are being bullied to go around their immediate supervisor and bring that to your attention as the next level supervision. So kiss up, kick down is death knell for a leader. It is just a death knell for a leader. I mean, it seems to work occasionally. It seems to work for short periods of time in different institutions, but it's that boss character that some of that literature described there. I do think there's a difference between being a leader during the boom times and being a leader during the bust. And I've said a number of times I'd rather be a leader during the boom time, of course. And Seamus O'Shea, our dear former provost, more than once told me, Mr. President, you're really lucky to be here when oil was on its way up, not when it was $7. And I agree, but there are differences between leading when we are in a boom time. Certainly during a boom time, there's a lot more going on. A lot more activities, a lot busier, lots of issues. You usually don't staff up to deal with the issues, so people find themselves busier and busier. You're finding that in the roles you play within your institution, this institution or your own institution. There's lots of expectations during boom times, and that's probably the hardest thing to handle, is the expectations of people go up faster than the boom goes up. But I still say it's better to be around in a boom than a bust. I think during the bust, it's not theoretical at all. You're dealing with issues that people get hurt by. People get laid off. They have salary cuts. Nothing theoretical about that. It's very painful to go through that. And although Ontario, at least Brock, didn't go through the same budget reduction exercise that Alberta did, we went through that at Brock when I was dean, and it wasn't fun at all. You get through it because you have to. But I would, any day of the week, give me oil at 100. No, I guess that's not entirely good either. I know that. But any day of the week, I'd rather be a leader during a boom time than during a bust time. But they're very different. Now, let me just quickly say a few words about the different levels of university leaders. The chair is essentially the parent of the family. Now, it depends upon how you're set up as a department and so on. But you know, the chair is the family. Departments are families. You've got the sage of the family. You got the youngsters that just came into the family. You got the outsiders who just can't seem to come to family gatherings without causing a stink. And you got the parent of the family, and that's the chair. And the chair's duty is to keep the family together, keep the discussion going, do all the things the dean is asking the chair to do, but you're all in the same discipline. You all share this common framework of intellectualism that puts you in the field you're in. And I think that's an interesting distinction, because deans, it's different for deans. Deans are experts in one field, but they have to be responsible for all the fields within their faculty. Arts and sciences here is, I believe, 20 departments. And I mean, it's a collection of very, very different departments, and the dean is an economist. So, you know, the dean's role differs, first off, and you're not an expert in the same field everybody else is in, but you are expected. You're expected to know the major ideas of the field. You're expected to know who the leaders are of physics in Canada, or history, or whatever it might be, because you're the dean of the faculty, and there is that expectation of you. Now, deans have an especially difficult role to play. Deans live in both worlds. They are formally senior administrators by virtue of the University Act. They are, in practice, senior administrators. But they also live in the faculty world. And so does Andy, and so do I, but not to the same extent that deans do. So deans have an issue with balancing these various competing forces that come from disciplines that they are not especially well versed in. And also, they've got the senior administration that they report to saying, well, Mr. Dean, have you dealt with this issue? And I really, really enjoyed being dean. But I think it was dean during a very special time at Brock. But it is certainly a job where, as they say, the rubber hits the road. The vice president and provost, well, you know, these jobs have evolved, as I said earlier. If we were in a corporate environment, we would call the VP and provost the chief operating officer of the university. There's no question the person is the senior vice president. It doesn't matter if that person's only been on the job 8 months or 8 years or 13 years. They're still the senior vice president of the university by virtue of what a university is, and they are the academic vice president. And we have started using the term provost more and more, and formally designated our vice presidents as provost. I guess 10 years or so the board took that title and used it. And the provost is also the chief academic officer of the university. Now I make that point because it used to be the president was the chief academic officer of the university. Used to be in the 50s, and that was before I went to university. But in the early 60s, the president was the expert on Greek civilization, whatever it may be. The president lived on campus. The president would have students over to his or her house, and they would have seminars in the living room where they would debate the issues of the day. And it used to be the president was more free to comment on social issues of the day, whatever it might be, and to comment with authority. Then something happened, and that something was the 60s. And that something was the revolution that occurred on our campuses in the 60s. And I think what it's done is to change the job of the president. I think it's changed the job of the provost. I think into the public arena. So that now, and I'm not saying this is right, and I'm not sure this applies to every president. Outside the university that brings the face of the university into the premier's office or into the Chamber of Commerce or whatever it may be. You know, it's not an all or none thing, and we try to involve our senior administrators in meeting with the press across the board. So you would have seen Karen Clearwater's photo in the Herald on the weekend standing out in the new sports stadium project. You know, I think it's important that the light shine on Karen sometimes. It's not always my face that's out there. But I do believe what presidents have done is they've been forced to retreat from that battle that occurred on the campuses in the late 60s. Maybe not retreat, maybe that's the wrong word. But I think as universities have become more and more scrutinized by the public, the role of the president has become more and more a public relations job, if you will. And I'm trivializing that to some extent, but not greatly. I do think that you've got to be part of a team. You've got to have somebody to talk to. We talk about it, just about everything. Sometimes it is 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, are you awake? You know, I am now. You do have to have somebody to talk to, and I've been very fortunate that Elsa is. We've been married 36 years now, and I feel very fortunate that every step I've made along the way as a biologist, as a teacher, and certainly as I hope I can use the word leader to apply to myself, but senior administrator, I certainly think that I've been very fortunate to have worked with you all along the way. It's an extremely interesting job. It's fascinating. I mean, I have been to feedlots, I've been to the sugar factory, you know, I've been...
Dairies.
Oh, yeah, dairies, you know. I mean, I've taken people up on invitations to... I have found it fascinating to see how people make a living. And they're all different. And that is the absolute best part of my job, is going out and meeting people and serving as a representative of the University of Lethbridge. Working with government has its ups and downs. We're obviously in a high point right now with the government, having had some really great announcements recently. But it's been a tremendous amount of work. And it has required a really strong team to move that along as well. And working with donors, well, I've never had a year like this. You know, we're coming up on December the 7th, which is not only the anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day for those other Americans in the room, it's the anniversary of John Prentice Day. Because it was on December the 7th of last year that John Prentice's son handed me a handwritten check for $8 million. I mean, you know, that doesn't happen very often. And so, and then if we just follow the year, it's been the 40th anniversary. We opened the First Choice Center. We've got the new Education Center. Well, you're in it. I know there are still issues about operating it, of course. That takes a year. Takes a year. Rule of thumb, new headquarters, 1 year. Because it takes that long to know how to use a building and how to operate a building. Always has in my experience anyway. You know, we've just had these wonderful government announcements. We've had all kinds of people back to campus. 2 weeks ago, I was in Vancouver. Arthur Erickson's Conservancy had a special reception for Dr. Erickson to commemorate, to mark the 40th anniversary of the University of Lethbridge. So, you know, how much better can it get? Really and truly, meeting all these wonderful people, getting to work with all you wonderful people. How much better can it get? It'd be nice to be back in the classroom. Anyway, I've found it very satisfying to work in the various jobs I've had over the years, and I've probably taken longer for this conversation than I wanted, but that's pretty much my recollection of journeys through education administration for a while. So thank you very much.